Good day. Today is Tuesday, 2nd September 2025, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit meeting in Tianjin has now ended. But the meetings that are taking place in China have not. In fact, many of the leaders who attended the meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting in Tianjin, including President Putin of Russia, have now moved from Tianjin to Beijing, where they will now start attending the celebrations of China's victory over Japan in the Second World War. And there's going to be a big parade, and there's already been a meeting between Xi Jinping and Putin, and no doubt there will be other meetings as well. Further, other additional leaders who did not attend the SCO meeting are now coming to China to celebrate the Victory Day celebration meetings and the Victory Day celebrations. One of them is Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea. He will no doubt have meetings with both Putin and Xi. But another leader who's come to Beijing to attend the Victory Day celebrations in Beijing is Robert Fico, the Prime Minister of Slovakia. And Fico has used the opportunity to have a meeting with Putin. And over the course of the meeting, they discussed various matters about energy, where Russia continues to supply energy to Slovakia, and by the way to Hungary. And over the course of that meeting, incidentally, Slovakia disclosed that an increasing amount of the gas that it receives from Russia is coming no longer through the Druzhba pipelines that crossed Ukraine itself, the old Soviet pipelines built during the 1980s and before, but instead the pipeline gas is now reaching Slovakia and presumably Hungary via the whole huge complex of pipelines that now connect Russia and Turkey. Turk Stream is the most important of these. Turkey acts as a hub, and the gas is then channeled through southern Europe and reaches Slovakia and Hungary. So they're no longer as dependent on the Druzhba pipeline as they were, and they continue to receive that natural gas in that way. Now, they also discussed, Fico and Putin also briefly discussed the Ukraine crisis. In my opinion, Putin didn't provide much in the way of additional information. He said that Russian actions in the Ukraine conflict have been entirely responsive and defensive. He rejected all claims that Russia has some kind of aggressive intentions towards Europe. He said that the Russians were forced into taking the actions that they did because the relentless policy of NATO expansion and the coup in Ukraine in February 2014, which brought to power, unconstitutionally, an intensely anti-Russian government, a government that was not just anti-Russian, but anti the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine itself, made a Russian intervention in the end ultimately unavoidable. Obviously, the Ukrainians would have a different view, and of course the West does as well, but it is Putin's view. It is a view very widely shared in Russia. It has been reiterated by Putin again and again, a fact which, by the way, Putin pointed out over the course of his meeting with Fico. And any attempt to try to understand the Ukrainian conflict and to try to seek a compromise or an end to the Ukrainian conflict has to take this Russian view into account. Of course, that is something which Western leaders categorically refuse to do. They refuse to accept that Russia has its own point of view about the crisis in Ukraine, that this is a view that the Russians believe in and have come to, and which they express in good faith. You might not accept it, but you have to understand that the Russians themselves believe it. But Western leaders never do that. So many Western commentators refuse to accept it either. They trot out all the usual memes and cliches about Putin being the ogre, Putin being the predator, Russia having undertaken an aggressive land grab. We're told that NATO expansion had nothing to do with the situation in Ukraine. This endless litany of comments that one hears in the West must be very frustrating to the Russians. And one of the things that Putin said is that when he brought all of these topics up with Trump at the summit meeting in Anchorage, to his relief, he found that Trump listened and appeared to engage with them. And he contrasted this with the previous approach taken by the Biden administration, which, like the current leaders in Europe, simply ignored all of the things, all of the observations that the Russians made, and all of the concerns that they expressed. Anyway, Putin also spoke about possibilities for ending the conflict, though here he was very brief. He said that for the Russians, NATO membership of Ukraine remains an absolute red line. I mean, he made that quite clear. He also said that he thought that finding some way to guarantee Ukraine's security after the war was far from impossible. He said that he was hopeful that a consensus to achieve that could be achieved. I have to say, listening to the rhetoric coming from Europe, I am much more sceptical about that, to put it mildly. And Putin briefly said, he mentioned that Russia had never objected to Ukraine's membership of the EU. This was never an issue for Russia. It was not the issue that brought the conflict about. But I noticed that he appeared to be using the passive tense, which I think may suggest that in time that Russian position is going to change. He didn't reiterate or make clear that Russia would never object to Ukraine's membership of NATO, of the EU. He seemed, as I said, to me, at least, to be talking about this as a historic issue. He also said something else, which is about energy, which is, of course, an important issue for Fico, for the Slovaks, who still get much of their energy from Russia, and for whom the energy, the gas and the oil, is transferred to Slovakia through Russian pipelines, some of which still cross Ukraine. And Putin said that for a long time, the Russians avoided attacks on the Ukrainian energy system, but the Ukrainians did not hold back and did launch attacks on the Russian energy system and on other Russian civilian infrastructure. And that was what eventually caused the Russians to respond with their own attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Here, I have to say, I think Putin is being economical with the truth. If my memory serves me correctly, Russian attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure began in October 2022. And I don't recall that the Ukrainians had launched the kind of sustained attacks on Russia's energy infrastructure in 2022, which admittedly they are indeed conducting now. But What the Ukrainians did do in the autumn of 2022 was plant a bomb on the Kerch Bridge. And there was an explosion on the Kerch Bridge, which is civilian infrastructure, but not, or if you prefer, dual-use infrastructure, though I don't believe the Russian military uses it very much. But anyway, civilian infrastructure, undoubtedly. But not, as far as I'm aware, energy infrastructure. And Russian missile strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, missile strikes, began shortly after, and the Russians at the time claimed that this was in retaliation to the attack on the Kerch Bridge. I've always felt, myself, that the Russians, at some point in the summer of 2022, resolved to start launching these attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Their purpose was primarily at that time to force the Ukrainians to use their air defense system, which at that time was based around the Soviet-era S-300 missile system. And the Russian intention was to deplete that system so as to make it possible for the Russian Air Force to start taking active steps, active action across the territory of Ukraine. An objective which the Russians have mostly achieved, by the way. Now, of course, the Russians back in 2022, 2023 were also, I think, assessing the energy infrastructure. And I still also hold to the view expressed at that time by the commentator and journalist John Helmer, who of course is extremely familiar with Russian thinking, that one of the things that the Russians were doing back in 2022 was trying to learn how the Ukrainian energy system worked, so that if the point ever came when they needed to knock it out in its entirety, they would know how to do it. Anyway, that was the meeting between Putin and Fico. A friendly meeting. The two men obviously get on. There was inquiries from each about the other's health and things of that kind. But that was the meeting that took place between Fico and Putin. It was not the most important meeting, not by far, amongst the many meetings that have taken place in Tianjin and in Beijing. The person who has dominated these events, both the ones in Tianjin and the ones that are now currently underway in Beijing, unsurprisingly, is the host, President Xi Jinping of China. And he's had meetings with Putin. He's had several meetings with Putin, and he's due to have more meetings with Putin, by the way, and I will come to those in a moment. And he's also had very, very friendly meetings with Modi, and as I expected, there was a group meeting of Putin, Xi and Modi, and the three were holding hands at various times. They seemed very relaxed and happy to be with each other, and the meeting clearly went extremely well. Now, the Americans are clearly infuriated by this meeting. Peter Navarro, Donald Trump's tariff economics and trade person, has continued the barrage of critical comments that he's been making about Prime Minister Modi and about India. He has said that he cannot understand why Modi would want to go to Beijing, given that China and India have been for so long in a state of Cold War and sometimes hot war with each other. He seems somehow personally offended by this. And I get the sense that many people in the United States are. The President of the United States himself, Donald Trump, has written another post about India just a few hours ago on Truth Social, using, it must be said, much more measured language than Peter Navarro. Anyway, he says that from an American point of view, ending the relationship, the economic relationship with India might not have been such a big deal because the relationship was completely one-sided. The Indians sold massive quantities of goods to the United States, but because of their very high tariff regime, the United States was not able to sell similar quantities of goods to India. He also made the claim, by the way, that the Indians have indicated that they're prepared to move to a zero tariff regime with the United States, though Trump said that time for that is running out. I should say here again that I don't know what President Trump is actually talking about, because I've heard nothing from any Indian official or from Prime Minister Modi himself which suggests that the Indians are seriously thinking of moving to some kind of no tariff regime in terms of imports from the United States. The Europeans, of course, agreed to that, but the Indians have not. And on the contrary, Prime Minister Modi has gone out of his way to say that India will defend the rights of its huge numbers of agricultural producers. This is a non-negotiable issue for him. At least that is what Prime Minister Modi has been saying. Now, there's been a certain amount of commentary, I've noticed, in the media in Britain and in the United States, which is now basically engaging in recriminations about the improvement in relations between India and China. And here I'm going to make a number of observations of my own. Firstly, if two great powers, China and India, two nuclear powers, the world's two biggest countries, decide to bury the hatchet and improve their relations and work towards achieving peace and friendship between them, then I would have thought that that was an unequivocally good thing. I am frankly depressed by the way, on the contrary, in the West, we treat this as a bad thing, that we want China and India to be adversaries and enemies, and somehow we get offended, as Peter Navarro appears to be offended, because the Indians have decided that the time has come to improve their relations with China. This, to me, is a nihilistic approach to foreign relations, treating everything like some kind of great game instead of looking at what surely are the best interests of humanity, which is that two huge nuclear powers, both China and India are nuclear powers, should move forward to settle their differences and improve their relations. That is one thing. Anyway, the second thing I wanted to say is that going back to the assumption that it is somehow a bad thing for the West if China and India see a deterioration in their relations, there's an enormous amount of recrimination and finger-pointing going on, and a lot of the finger-pointing is being made towards Donald Trump. It's been said that he's done a whole series of things that have offended and outraged the Indians. For example, having a 2-hour lunch with the chief of the Pakistani military, meddling in the conflict between India and Pakistan, and give the exchange of fighting that took place a few weeks ago, and giving the impression that the United States had brokered a ceasefire when that almost certainly was not the case, and when the reality was that it was Pakistan that sought the ceasefire. At least that's what the Indians say. The Indians were extremely annoyed by this, and Prime Minister Modi was extremely annoyed by this, and the Indians have made no secret of this fact. But no one, as far as I can see, seriously denies that the single biggest issue, the event that has caused the relationship, the once very friendly relationship between India and the United States to break down, was the decision of the United States to impose tariffs on India because India was buying Russian oil. And all sorts of people are writing about what a terrible mistake Donald Trump made by doing that, how taking that step misunderstood India completely, and how it has made India move closer to Russia and China. Well, there's been articles about this, editorials in the Financial Times, in The Guardian. There's been an article about this in the Daily Telegraph, and there's been any number of articles about this in the American media as well. And it is Donald Trump's flat-footed, coercive diplomacy which is supposed to be at fault. The fact that he took this decision to impose these tariffs on India is entirely his fault, and he is to blame because India and China are now reconciling. Well, all I would say is all of these media outlets where I've been reading this have been relentless advocates of escalating the economic war against Russia. The idea of tariffing, imposing tariffs on Russia's trade partners, the countries that buy energy from Russia, did not originate, so far as I know, with Donald Trump. It originated with Senator Lindsey Graham and his friend, Senator Richard Blumenthal. They have put forward a bill which is still there in the Senate. It's not yet been voted on, but we're told that 80 senators support it, which would mandate the president, or in its original form, would have mandated the president to impose these massive tariffs on countries that bought oil and gas and other energy products from Russia, including, of course, India itself. And all of these media outlets that I have been talking about, far from criticising this bill, far from criticising Senator Graham, on the contrary, always, invariably talk about Senator Graham with enormous respect. They treat him as an individual of weight and substance and mature and adult judgment, one of the great pillars of American statecraft at this time. I haven't seen a single article which says that this decision to impose tariffs on India because it was buying Russian oil is Lindsey Graham's fault. Not one. And I've not seen one article anywhere that suggests that the fact that India is now reconciling with China is in some way Lindsey Graham's fault also. Instead, all of the blame is put once more on Donald Trump. Sometimes I get the sense that if Donald Trump was not the president of the United States, if he did not exist, one would almost have to invent him in order to give people like Lindsey Graham a pass. Anyway, there it is. If you don't like the effects of the policy, if you think it's a very bad thing, as I said already, I don't, that China and India are becoming friends instead of enemies, then, well, ask yourself, who is really to blame? Is it Donald Trump, meandering and sometimes vacillating as he is, or is it Lindsey Graham, who has consistently and continuously demanded the most extreme measures against every party and every country as he looks for confrontation everywhere and anywhere, including against India in this instance. In fact, since I'm talking about Lindsey Graham, just before I did this program, I saw what appears to be a message that he's now posted in which he seems to be threatening Norway one of the US's most stalwart allies with sanctions and tariffs and all sorts of things, because Norway's sovereign wealth fund isn't investing in Caterpillar, an American company, because of Caterpillar's connections supposedly with Israel. I don't know much about the story, but it is Lindsey Graham's style. Anyway, let's move on. I discussed oil, I was discussing gas, and perhaps the other thing to say about the last couple of days in Tianjin, though it has received minimal coverage in the West, is that China and Russia have now finally signed off on the Power of Siberia pipeline, Power of Siberia 2. Now, when Xi Jinping visited Moscow for Russia's Victory Day celebrations on the 9th of May, I speculated that perhaps we would see a signing ceremony take place there on this mammoth project that has been in discussion and negotiation for a long time. But in the event it didn't take place. But I said that I thought it would probably happen this year. And I said that it would probably happen. I thought it was likely to happen over the course of Putin's visit to China, which would take place later in the year. And well, Putin is now in China, and sure enough, the signing ceremony has indeed taken place. Now, Putin, of course, is not the signatory. This is a agreement between Russia's gas export company, Gazprom, and the relevant Chinese company, which will be importing the gas. And I noticed that Mongolia also participated in the signing ceremony. And that confirms that the pipeline will pass through Mongolia. There was some speculation at one point earlier this year that it would pass through Kazakhstan, though, to be frank, that never seemed to me to make a huge amount of sense from a geographical point of view. But anyway, the point is the memorandum of agreement has been signed. There's been some discussion about the fact that the larger, bigger contractual documents have not been signed, or at least we don't know yet that they have been signed. But this is the public signing ceremony. It is a legally binding agreement. I think it is inconceivable that the rest, all of the other parts of what I suspect is a simply gigantic sequence of agreements and documents connected to this enormous energy project that they have not been by now agreed in detail. And no doubt we will be getting the details gradually over the next few months, though some of them may be held back because of reasons of commercial and even national security secrecy. So Power of Siberia 2 is going to go ahead, and it's going to supply China with about half the quantities of natural gas, pipeline gas, that Russia used to export to Europe. And of course, there's already Power of Siberia 1 in operation. And Russia, of course, has become a major exporter of liquefied natural gas, and it is likely to increase the volumes there as well. Once Power of Siberia 2 is completed, and I have absolutely no doubt that it will be completed, I'm going to make my own guess that by that point, Russia will have fully restored, at least in volume terms, its gas exports to the level that they were in February 2022, when the sanctions were imposed, except that the gas will not be going west towards Europe. It will be going east towards China. And here is the interesting theory, because it's been suggested that once Power of Siberia 2 is completed, and this will be a project of several years, I mean, it's a huge project, but one which, it must be said immediately, both the Russians and the Chinese are very familiar with. And the Chinese, and by the way, the Russians, but especially the Chinese, are able to build huge infrastructure very, very fast. I saw, for example, that China has just recently completed what is, in terms of altitude, the highest bridge in the world, the highest motorway bridge in the world, a staggering engineering achievement in less time than it takes in Britain to build a small motorway bypass. So the Chinese and the Russians will get this done, and they will get this done fast. The scale of the project means it will take years, but not that many years. The idea apparently then is that once Power of Siberia 2 is fully up and running, once China is able to receive the gas in the volumes that it wants and needs, then the 2 gas pipelines to China will be scaled up and expanded. And there's suggestions, I've seen reports, that the gas could then start to flow to third parties, to the Koreas, perhaps, though the Russians would be fully able, I would have thought, to build gas pipelines directly to North Korea, if that was their wish. And in theory, they could then be extended south to South Korea as well. So obviously, geopolitical conflicts make that difficult. But perhaps more importantly, westwards towards India, and perhaps ultimately to India itself, and south perhaps also to Myanmar and to Indochina. Now, that is a colossal project, one which could bind together in an giant energy complex, the whole of Eastern Eurasia. Of course, other countries, Iran, for example, would no doubt want to participate in this as well. Perhaps Qatar, too. I mean, one can imagine all kinds of countries wanting to become involved in such a project. But apparently, the preliminary discussions of that are underway. And of course, in the event that a project like this does materialize, and as I said, the scale of it is staggering, then of course it will bind together all of these various different regions and countries, and it will create a community of energy relationships and of course economic relationships also and as well. So there it is, an enormous development, Power of Siberia 2, and it surprises me, by the way, that it has not been given the attention that it has been. One curious aspect, by the way, about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, which again has also received minimal attention in the West, is that 2 countries made applications to join the SCO, Armenia and Azerbaijan, and both had their requests rejected. India vetoed Azerbaijan's accession, and Pakistan vetoed Armenia's. Russia was not involved, and Putin seems to have had a cordial meeting with the Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan. It's not difficult to understand what happened. India is a friend of Armenia's. Armenia is a friend of India. Azerbaijan, by contrast, is a friend of Pakistan's. Each country has annoyed one or the other of the two permanent adversaries, Pakistan and India, and the result is that Armenia got vetoed by Pakistan and Azerbaijan got vetoed by India. Another blow, perhaps more, for the president of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, more I suspect for him than for Pashinyan, whose real interests are with the West, just to say. But Aliyev clearly has wanted to develop relations with China and the Asian states. And he must also be feeling under significant pressure because over the last couple of weeks, the Russians have taken off the gloves and have been attacking energy infrastructure in Ukraine, much of which has a Azerbaijani connection, or in some cases is even owned by Azerbaijani interests. And I think that Aliyev has found that infuriating. Anyway, there we go. I'm not going to spend more time on that. So, Power of Siberia 2 has been signed. And as I said, that is, if one is looking for a concrete agreement, that is perhaps the single most substantive thing that has come out of these summits, of the summits in Tianjin and Beijing so far. Though there is talk again of industry cooperation, and China and Russia do seem again to be moving forward with their wide-bodied aircraft project, which they'd been working on for some years, but which was then suspended, work of which was suspended in 2022, but apparently it is now resuming as well. The Russians are proposing that their new big aircraft engine, the P-35, should be used for this project, and it's quite likely, I suspect, that it will be. But the other big statement, position, which was proposed over the course of these meetings is a regulation or declaration about new styles of global governance that was proposed by the Chinese leader Xi Jinping. Now, as with most of these sort of Chinese declarations, I have to say that it's interesting, but it is mostly declaratory. Basically, it comes down to 5 points. States should adhere to the principle of sovereign equality. In other words, all states should be treated as equal. That is, of course, the founding principle of the United Nations and of its charter, just saying. All states should abide by international rule of law. All states should practice multilateralism. All states should advocate the people-centered approach, and states should focus on taking real actions. I mean, it's all very declaratory, and on its face, I have to say it doesn't seem to amount to very much. It's very much the Chinese style, however, to make these very, very broad brush statements to get as many as possible of countries to sign up to them. And all of the countries that attended the SCO meeting have signed up to this one. And then to take this forward and to repeat these 5 principles when having discussions with countries that supposedly are not abiding by them. And of course, the country in question, from the Chinese point of view, the obvious country is the United States. Xi Jinping has already, in coded language, not very thinly coded language, has referred to the United States as a bully. And the Chinese obviously know that the United States cannot and will not accept any conception of sovereign equality. It will never agree that it be put on the same level as other countries. The whole conception of American exceptionalism, now universally accepted in the United States, goes against it. And of course, as for international rule of law, well, that is something which the United States does sometimes proclaim its commitment to. But as we all know, mostly it talks about the rules-based international order, which is essentially whatever the United States dreams up from any one particular point of time. So one can see what the Chinese are doing here. They're establishing a kind of philosophical framework that they can use effectively in future discussions with the Americans, saying that they have an international consensus behind them. And it's very much the Chinese style, and I think it means rather more, because it's the Chinese doing it. If it's the Americans who are coming up with something like this, one could ignore it. But because it's the Chinese, one should take this a little bit more seriously, because, as I said, it fits into the way they approach global problems. And as I said, I suspect we'll be hearing more about these 5 points from the Chinese, and who knows, even perhaps from others, as events, as times progress. Anyway, the next big event is going to be the military parade in Beijing. I suspect it's going to be huge, and obviously Xi Jinping will be there, and Fico will be there, and Kim Jong-un will be there, and other leaders will be there, and I gather there will be representatives of, well, the Prime Minister of Vietnam will be there, and other representatives of other countries will be there as well. So this is going to be a huge parade, and there'll be further meetings and further agreements, and obviously I will cover them in this program. Now, contrast these meetings in Tianjin. Again, I said this in my program yesterday, but contrast the meeting in Tianjin and the one that's taking place in Beijing. The meetings which come up with some actual, real, concrete agreements, like the agreement to go forward with Power of Siberia 2, the agreement to set up the development bank that I talked about in my program yesterday, the conceptual framework, which is the global governance initiative, which I've just been speaking about, and the relaxed and happy atmosphere that you see in these meetings, with the fevered meetings taking place in Europe as the so-called coalition of the willing. Starmer and Macron's coalition of the willing comes together. Now, we now have confirmation that there will be a coalition of the willing meeting chaired by Macron, and it is going to take place in Paris on Thursday. Starmer, of course, will be there. No doubt Ursula von der Leyen will be there, and Friedrich Merz will be there, and Giorgia Meloni will also be there. All of these people are going to be attending this meeting. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, they will be busy talking about the same things that they've been talking about since March, which is how to deploy European troops to Ukraine, the kind of security guarantees they want to give to Ukraine, never mind what the Russians agreed to, but they want to give to Ukraine, what the Americans are going to do, all of those things. They're going to be discussing all the same things all over again. And Zelensky, of course, is certain to be there, and the rhetoric will be fevered and angry and borderline hysterical, I would say. And we are going to have a very, very different type of meeting from the one that has taken place in Tianjin and the one which is taking place in Beijing. And, well, just to get a flavour of what is coming, consider the strange story of Russia's alleged GPS interference in Ursula von der Leyen's plane, aircraft, as she was flying into Bulgaria for a visit of inspection. I think that's what I'm going to call it. Supposedly the Russians were jamming the GPS of the plane, and that caused the plane to fly around for an hour and delayed the landing of the plane, and the pilots had to use maps because they couldn't use GPS, and the implication was that this was an aggressive and hostile act by the Russians. Now, I'm going to say straight away that I have great doubts about the entire account of this incident. There are many who say that it didn't occur. There are entities, organizations, which claim to track GPS signals, and they say that there was no interference at the time at all, and that Ursula's plane was delayed for 10 minutes, not 1 hour, and nothing like what she described took place. Against that, the European Commission itself is, perhaps unsurprisingly, supporting what the EU Commission President, Ursula herself, and her officials are saying. Well, I'm not going to get into the details of this. I'm not going to pretend that I know much about how to jam GPS signals and whether it's possible to jam GPS signals going to one specific plane, or whether if you did jam signals it would affect a larger area. I suspect that's true, but as I said, I don't know for a fact one way or the other. All I would say is that this incident has been given so much attention. Is it real? Is it realistic that whatever it was that might have happened, assuming it even happened at all, was that consequential? At worst, this looks to me like an act of harassment rather than anything more than that. And as I said, I'm very skeptical that in fact anything actually did take place. But put that aside, isn't this exactly what we're going to hear more of when the meeting in Paris takes place? There's going to be, I am sure, talk about the aggressive nature of the Russians, the attempts that were made to interfere with Ursula's plane, more talk about how if we don't stop the Russians over there, they're going to come and attack us over here. We're going to have all of this inflammatory, extraordinary rhetoric pouring out of Paris. And, well, there is going to be, again, all kinds of declarations and shows of support for the man who's going to be the hero of the hour, yet again, President Zelensky of Ukraine. Now, I talked about all of this yesterday in my program, but I do want to reiterate again that these leaders, especially perhaps Macron and Starmer, but to some extent all of them, are wasting their time, even as more pressing things start to weigh down on their nations. If we are talking about France, on Monday, the French government is likely to fall. The French socialist leader, Olivier Faure, has now come out and has said that his party will definitely be voting against the budget, Monsieur Barrou's budget, which Monsieur Bayrou, the French Prime Minister, has said is a matter of confidence. So if the budget is defeated, Monsieur Bayrou is going to resign, and it looks as if it will be defeated and he will resign. Monsieur Faure is now in fact going out and saying that as far as he's concerned, he has only one word to say to Monsieur Bayrou, which is goodbye. So the French government looks like it is about to fall. Everybody that I know agree that the situation in France is politically unstable and it is becoming financially, well, if not unsustainable, very close to being that. France's budget deficit is over 5% of GDP. France's debt to GDP ratio is 114% of GDP. The stresses are growing across the entire French economic system, and it looks as if, again, in a few days, France is going to be without a government. Now, one would have thought that in a time like that, in that kind of crisis, the job of the President of France is to remain in France, to try to talk, well, the meeting, the coalition of the willing meeting, I suppose, is happening in France, but to give all his attention to this crisis in France. After all, there is no reason why this coalition of the willing meeting, which is due to take place in Paris on Thursday, has to happen in Paris on Thursday. It could be postponed till next week, or better still, it could be scrapped, and it wouldn't be necessary to hold it at all, because, as I said, it simply is rehashing ideas that have been discussed and discussed and discussed again for weeks and months, going all the way back to March, with the first hints about it extending back further still to February. So, isn't it more important that the President of France, the leader of France at this time, focuses on this problem in France? He could be calling in the leaders of the various parties. He could speak, he could actually take steps to do what he has basically avoided doing up to now. He could speak to the two leaders of the two big opposition parties, who between them have a clear majority in the French Parliament, Jean-Luc Mélenchon of the left and Marine Le Pen on the right, and he could call them in and he could talk to them and discuss and see whether there might be some way forward. And he could talk to other members of other parties, and he could consult in the cabinet, and he could address the French nation about the situation, and he could do everything that a president could be expected to do in this situation to try to sort the problems out ahead of this crunch vote on Monday. It's not as if the finance minister of France, Monsieur Eric Lombard, has not actually come forward and said that if the vote fails, if the government falls, if the budget is not passed, there might have to be a referral to the International Monetary Fund, presumably in conjunction with the European Central Bank and the European Commission. In other words, France might need a bailout. Now, I understand that Lombard has subsequently tried to walk back that comment, but he did make it, admittedly, in response to a question, and it was he who let this particular cat out of the bag, if you like. So this clearly is a high-stakes situation in France. In the case of the Prime Minister of Britain, Sir Keir Starmer, I would say the situation is, if anything, even worse. I say that because yesterday in Britain, the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, engaged in a reorganisation of his private office. And what he did was he took the Chancellor, the Finance Minister, Rachel Reeves' chief economics advisor, and transferred this person from the Treasury to Starmer's own office. And he also recruited various important, certain, I don't know how important they actually are, but certain economists. He seemed to be taking steps, in other words, and this is how it is being reported in the media in Britain, to establish within his own office an alternative economics team to the one that his Chancellor, his Finance Minister, Rachel Reeves, nominally heads in the Treasury. So, as of today, we have two separate economic teams in Britain. One based in the Treasury, the Finance Ministry, ultimately headed by the Finance Minister, the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, and another in Downing Street, the Prime Minister's office and residence, headed ultimately by Keir Starmer. And it's difficult to see this move as anything other than an indication that Starmer is not satisfied with Rachel Reeves' performance. Now, some of you may remember that a couple of weeks ago, after the Starmer government had to retreat on certain proposals made by Reeves, the Chancellor, to cut welfare spending, that there was a moment when the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, was addressing the House of Commons, and the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, was sitting next to him, and it was clear that she was in a state of very considerable personal distress as the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, batted away questions about whether the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, enjoyed his confidence. And there was a lot of criticism of the Prime Minister at that time for his heartlessness and cruelty towards his own Finance Minister and his failure to support her. And then we got a number of statements from the Prime Minister's office trying to excuse and explain away what happened and suggesting that in fact all was still well between the Chancellor and the Prime Minister. But now it seems to me that we can see that in fact the Prime Minister is indeed starting to give positive, incontrovertible, clear signs that he has indeed lost confidence in his Chancellor. Because if he did have confidence in her, why would he need to build up what frankly looks like an alternative economic team within his own office? Now, I suspect that what is going to happen is that Reeves is going to present a budget in a few weeks' time. The Prime Minister is worried, correctly, that this budget is unlikely to impress the financial markets, at which point he could quite plausibly hide behind his current economics team and say, well, this is the Chancellor's plan, my people have a somewhat different plan, and you mustn't blame me for any problems in the markets. And, well, now that I have my own team, I can dispense with the services of my Chancellor and can appoint someone else in her place who will follow the plans that my team are working out. That's, I have to say, how it is looking to me. Now, is that a sign of a stable situation in Britain? There's been talk already from economists about Britain needing to apply to the IMF for a bailout. I've already explained how if there was a financial crisis of that kind in Britain, it would be far more severe than the one that affected Britain in 1976, and there would not be enough funds in the IMF to effect such a bailout, and inevitably the government and the IMF would have to apply to the only country that might notionally have the funds to bail out Britain, which would of course be the United States, the US Treasury Department. They can always, after all, print money if they can do nothing else. Anyway, put that aside. Given that the Prime Minister doesn't have confidence in his Chancellor, given the difficult financial and economic situation in Britain, given that the Prime Minister appears to be taking preparatory steps to prepare for a bigger crisis in the financial markets and perhaps in politics in the autumn, isn't his job again to remain in Britain, to take charge of the situation, to hold meetings with Rachel Reeves, to discuss and find out what her budget plans actually are, to go over them in detail so that the Chancellor and the Prime Minister can present a united front to the House of Commons and to the nation? And if that is impossible, if the Prime Minister cannot do that now, shouldn't he simply sack his Chancellor without further delay and appoint somebody who does have his confidence, so that when the budget is prepared, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor can present a united front together? After all, as has been pointed out by several people, it is essential at a time of economic stress and crisis that the markets, not just the markets outside Britain, but economic players in Britain, and indeed the political class in its totality, believe that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister, are united and stand together. Whenever it appears, on the contrary, that there are divisions between the two, especially at a moment of crisis, the crisis deepens and very quickly moves from the area of finance and the markets and the economy to affect politics as well. It is not impossible. It is, in fact, entirely plausible that if things go badly wrong in Britain over the next few weeks, and there is a major crisis in the markets, given how confidence in the Prime Minister himself has collapsed, including amongst members of his own party, he himself could fall. So what is he doing, wasting his time in Paris, talking about soldiers that he's going to be moving around the map of Ukraine with his friend and pal, Macron, who's also, as I've discussed, in serious trouble? What is he doing? Wasting his time talking about all of these things at this particular point in time. Even as I am making this program, British government bond yields, in other words, the money the British government has to pledge to pay to investors who are prepared to buy British government debt, is rising. Bond yields are rising. The cost for the British government of borrowing is growing because confidence is draining away. It is apparently at a 27-year high, and all the indications are, every reason that I know suggests that those bond yields are going to go higher still. So again, why are we wasting our time? Why are our leaders wasting our time in this way? Now, the same could be said about all of the other European leaders too. Giorgia Meloni has had a very good run. She became Prime Minister of Italy at a time when the situation in Italy seemed to be relatively stable economically, but everybody accepts that underlying everything, the Italian economy remains overextended and its condition continues to be extremely fragile. Since I'm talking about Meloni, it is universally known that she and Macron can't stand each other, And surprise, surprise, there has been another row between France and Italy, the French and Italian governments. The French Prime Minister, Monsieur Bayrou, under more enormous pressure. After all, he's likely to lose his job in a few days, gave an interview to French television in which he said that one of the reasons there's a problem is that the Italians have managed to get their fiscal house so much in order that they're drawing away investors from France, and these investors are going to Italy instead, and somehow this was a bad and wicked thing done by Meloni's government to France. The Italians, Meloni has not responded well. There's been criticisms. There's been an argument between Italy and France. These arguments flare up all the time. Another sign of how unhappy these leaders ultimately are with each other, and how fragile, how desperately fragile the situation in Europe this autumn currently is. So, as I said, what exactly is it that these people think they're doing on Thursday? I believe there's another meeting, by the way, at a lower level of Europe ministers. This is a EU-only meeting going on in Copenhagen, but discussing exactly the same thing. Ukraine and how to help Ukraine and what more to do in relation to Ukraine and what more weapons to send to Ukraine, weapons that nobody has apparently, but nonetheless we can still talk about them, and economic assistance when we're already in debt. To repeat again, bankrupt economies in Europe, giving money to another economy, the Ukrainian economy, that is far beyond any point of simple bankruptcy. But anyway, we go on doing all of this. I said in my program yesterday that it all seemed to me a little bit like the crew of the Titanic being ordered by the captain to rearrange the deck chairs after the Titanic and the iceberg had already collided. Who can tell me that the situation is not like that in Europe today? And of course in Germany, the big economy of Europe, the great economic driver of Europe, well, things are not yet as bad, but they're going to become every bit as bad before very long. And if we're talking about Friedrich Merz, the Chancellor of Germany, precisely because ultimately it is going to be Germany that is going to have to write the checks if France has to be bailed out, one would have thought that his primary concern at this moment in time is not Ukraine, but at achieving stability in France. He ought to be speaking to his friend, his dear friend, Emmanuel Macron, about this. He ought to be making very clear his concerns about the deteriorating situation in France. That ought to be his primary objective. If we're going to have a meeting of European leaders at all, ought it not to be a meeting looking at the situation in France and perhaps other European countries like Italy and Spain, not about this perennial topic of Ukraine? But no, of course not. Merz talks about Ukraine. He isn't worried about the situation in Europe, the financial situation, the gathering financial crisis there. He is the Chancellor who is going to, keep the Russians at bay. He's going to help Ukraine. His plan ultimately is to exhaust the Russians, or so we're told, to force the Russians to compromise by exhausting them, even though every indicator points instead to it being Europe, including Germany itself, that is becoming exhausted. Once upon a time, not that long ago, I can remember times when there used to be European meetings, summit meetings. And yes, sometimes there would be argument and acrimony, but there would also be genuine debate and real discussion and agreements on how to move forward with various projects, even bad projects like European monetary union, in my opinion, turned out to be. But anyway, there were discussions about how to do this, about how to set up EURATOM and things of that kind. In other words, there would be meetings which bore some resemblance to the meetings that are taking place in China, which have been taking place over the last couple of days and which will continue to happen over the next few days. I can remember when European leaders, Giscard, Schmidt, Callahan, Thatcher, used to sit down, Mitterrand, Kohl, used to sit down and talk about serious things and try and work their way forward. When the European Commission was led by effective executives, people like Jacques Delors. Again, I'm not somebody who much agrees with much of what Delors did, but that he was an effective and competent man. Of that, there is no doubt. Look at the situation today. Look at the extraordinary escape from reality that is taking place in Europe. And tell me that the European people, who are the responsibility, the true responsibility of these leaders, are being properly served. Well, anyway, let's now turn to that topic, which of course all of these leaders are supposed to be so anxiously discussing with each other, which is the conflict in Ukraine. Well, there's been an enormous amount of excitement, or perhaps alarm, in Ukraine because the Russians published a photograph of the Russian military chief and chief of the general staff, Valery Gerasimov, sitting behind a desk in an office. It's assumed that it is his office, but it's not clear where this office is located, whether it's in the General Staff building in Moscow or, as I know some believe, in the headquarters of the special military operation in the southern Russian city of Rostov-on-Don. But anyway, behind the desk was a map, and the map showed territory in Ukraine, and it showed Donetsk and Lugansk and Zaporozhye and Kherson entirely under Russian control, the four regions under Russian control. It showed Crimea under Russian control, but it also showed Nikolaev and Odessa under Russian control as well. And of course, there's been enormous hubbub and hand-wringing and alarm expressed about this on Ukrainian channels, and they've been worrying about the purpose and intention of the map. Some are suggesting that it was an elaborate exercise in trolling by the Russians, an attempt to scare the Ukrainians in some way. Well, it might have been. Others are suggesting that this is indeed, that this actually does in fact outline actual Russian military objectives. I have to say that on balance, I lean to the second view, assuming that this map is real and that this photograph has not been AI generated, which I'm afraid I think is possible. If this map is indeed real, then I suspect that the Russians do have some kind of objective of this kind, or at least did have at some perhaps earlier point in the war. If there is no agreement, if there is no settlement within the next few months in Ukraine, if the Russians take control of the entire territory of the four regions, as they will, and the Ukrainians nonetheless continue to take the same stance that they are taking now. They refuse to recognize the four regions as Russian. They refuse to recognize Crimea as Russian. They insist that all of this territory must at some future time be returned to them. They insist on their right to join NATO. They continue to take the hardest possible line on the rights of Russian speakers or the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine itself. They refuse to scale down the size of their armies or to place any restrictions on the weapons it can buy, and they continue to insist on the most extravagant and inflated security guarantees that are on offer. Well, in that case, the war could continue, and in fact, probably will, or undoubtedly will continue. In which case, I think it is highly likely, especially if the Russians do capture the city of Zaporozhye, capture the city of Zaporozhye and recapture the city of Kherson on the west bank of the river, of the Dnieper, that they will indeed make Odessa and Nikolaev future objectives. I suspect that this map was probably created some time ago when Joe Biden was still president of the United States, and it seemed that there would be no negotiated outcome and that the war would have to be decided exclusively on the battlefield. Then Donald Trump came along and everything changed, and it looked like we would have some kind of negotiation. And, well, as we saw from his conversation with Robert Fico, which I just discussed earlier in this program, Putin still appears to think that a possible negotiated outcome of the war is still an eventuality that might happen. But if it doesn't happen, then I do believe that, as I said, the objectives set out in this map, which I suspect were earlier objectives, will be revived again. To repeat once more, I believe that following certain comments made by the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov over the course of an interview he recently gave to the Russian media, if there is a negotiated settlement, the Russians will bring up again the topic of federalization, and they will insist that Odessa and Nikolaev be granted substantial autonomy, which will enable them to realign their policies closer to Russia. If there is no negotiation, then the war will continue. The objectives will probably be the same as are set out in the map, and the Russians will move and advance and will occupy Odessa and Nikolaev as well once they have reached the river and then crossed it, which, it must be said, is still some time away. So I would just finish by saying this on this issue. If the Russians do cross the river, if they do occupy Odessa and Nikolaev, then Ukraine's brief history as an independent state is effectively ended, because a Ukraine which has lost control of the Dnieper and which is cut off from the Black Sea is no longer viable as a fully sovereign, independent state. It would be so dependent, in fact, on Russian goodwill that it is difficult to see how it could avoid becoming a full-out Russian ally, vassal, satellite, whatever it is you want to call it. So that's something that the Ukrainians perhaps ought to bear in mind, though at the moment it must be said they show no sign of doing so. Zelensky, as I said, will be in Paris on Thursday, begging again for more weapons and more money. He will be demanding more sanctions, including sanctions and tariffs against India and China. I spoke previously about Lindsey Graham's responsibility for the foreign policy debacle in the relationship between India and the United States, and the burgeoning relationship between India and China. But of course, another person who bears massive responsibility is Zelensky himself. And of course, he will not learn from this. He is incapable of doing so. Meanwhile, as I said, the war continues. And there's been more news from the Pokrovsk front lines. And the cumulative evidence strongly suggests that the Russians are now making significant headway inside Pokrovsk itself. There are suggestions that the entire Ukrainian defense in central Pokrovsk has now fully collapsed, that the Russians have not only cut the E50 road, but that they have reached the railway, and that the Ukrainian defense in Pokrovsk, which it's clear has been disorganized for some time, is in the process of breaking down. There's also been more reports of more Russian advances in Liman, and I've seen some extremely bitter pieces on the Ukrainian internet about what looks like a catastrophe that has played out north of Siversk in the Serebianka forest, though there is still no information about the fighting inside Siversk that Gerasimov said was already taking place. Now, there's also been some information of significant Russian advances in the Zaporozhye area and of Russian attacks from multiple directions, which appear to be focused on the southern town of Orekhov. Orekhov is the linchpin of Ukrainian defenses in Zaporozhye region. If the Russians were to capture it, the only significant populated center in Zaporozhye region outside Russian control would be the city of Zaporozhye itself. And Zaporozhye city would, in that case, be, in effect, under siege. And I am not sure that it is defendable, just to say. There are some claims that the Russians have achieved a serious breakthrough in the fighting around Orekhov, the advances that they're making towards Orekhov from the south, and of course they continue to advance towards Orekhov from the east as well. But it's the fighting in Pokrovsk, Konstantinovka, which remains the most important. Redovka yesterday, which has been consistently right about the situation in the Pokrovsk area, says that the Russians have now surrounded a battalion of Ukrainian troops, around 300 men, in Zoloty Kolodyez, and that they've also achieved effective encirclements of groups of Ukrainian troops north of Pokrovsk in a village called Volnoye, and also in Sharkovo, where the Russians, by general acknowledgement, appear to be closing in. Now, the Ukrainians, for their part, have been making all kinds of claims recently about various successful counterattacks that they are supposedly making across the front lines. And they've been publishing videos which supposedly verify or corroborate these counterattacks. There is some problems with them. For example, they published video footage of the village of Dachnia in Dnipropetrovsk region, which the Russians captured some weeks ago and which the Ukrainians claim to have recaptured. But then a short time after the Ukrainians published that footage, the Russians published their own footage, which appeared to show this particular village firmly under Russian control. And there's another village in the Kupiansk area, and there's lots of reports that the Ukrainians are suffering from some major crisis in the Kupiansk area. Anyway, there are reports that this village in the Kupiansk area has also been recaptured by the Ukrainians, but the Russians again have published footage which appears to confirm that they not only control the village, but the situation in this village is quiet. I have to say that I'm getting increasingly the impression that as the situation on the front lines deteriorates, instructions have been sent out from Kiev to try to, if you like, fabricate victories, or at least to give the impression of more successful activity by the Ukrainian armed forces than is in fact taking place. Radovka, which is of course a Russian magazine, did a detailed analysis of that incident, that video that was published a few days ago in the southwestern micro-district of Pokrovsk, which showed the Ukrainian tank firing and basically demolishing a building in the southwest micro-district of Pokrovsk. And Radovka said that this entire video was obviously staged and that anybody who is familiar with the fighting would know this instantly, because the Leopard 2, the tank, was operating entirely by itself, supposedly on the front lines, without any infantry protection. And this is not something you do in an urban warfare environment. And Radovka also made the point that this essential performance, the Leopard 2 firing at what was essentially, presumably, an empty building, ultimately came at a heavy cost for the tank crew, because as the Leopard 2 pulled back, it was tracked by the Russians and was of course destroyed by them using drones in central Pokrovsk. Now, I found the Radovka rebuttal of this video very convincing, and I have to say it reinforces a sense I've been having for several days, that many of these counterattacks that the Ukrainians are claiming have little real reality behind them. They claim, for example, to have recaptured another village in the West Donbass area, a village that seemed to be well behind Ukrainian lines, where nobody would expect the Russians to be. They said the Russians had stormed the village, then the Ukrainians carried out a successful counterattack, then the Russians were pushed back, and the village is back under Ukrainian control, and the Ukrainians were successful. They're now saying that there were only 4 Russian soldiers involved, 4 Russian soldiers supposedly occupying a whole village. I wonder whether in truth there were any Russian soldiers there at all. Just saying. Anyway, that's what I think. Perhaps the main focus is Pokrovsk, though judging from what Gerasimov was saying a few days ago, the situation for the Ukrainians in Konstantinovka, Siversk and Kupiansk is probably every bit as bad. But it does look as if the situation in Pokrovsk is becoming more critical for the Ukrainians. And, well, it's a biggish place. Its population used to be, before the war, in happier days, 85,000. So we're not talking about exactly a small town. And there's no verified proof that the Russians have crossed the railway line into northern Pokrovsk yet. But if all of these reports are true, then the Ukrainians are facing an operational crisis. Radovka still shows in its maps the Russian forces outside Grishine, and therefore, in effect, having outflanked the Ukrainians and basically blocked the Ukrainians from resupply in Pokrovsk. It could be that we're coming rapidly to a crisis in the Pokrovsk area, in which case, as I said, it will add to that wider sense of crisis in the world, in Europe, in the Middle East, that I've been talking about in various programs. Well, this is where I finish today's program. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this program. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.